So today we're beginning a new sermon series on the book of Judges. It's a book that contains a lot of exciting stories. Stories of Deborah, of Gideon, of Samson, and of many others. But we're not looking at any specific judge today, because today's chapter, chapter 2, serves as an introduction to the themes of the entire book. It sets the scene for Judges. So let's look at it now. Our reading today started with the death of Joshua, the son of Nun, who verse 8 describes as the servant of the Lord. Israel had been led for a long time by strong leaders. Moses had led them out of slavery in Egypt, followed by Joshua, who led them into the promised land. And then, after this high point in Israel's history, we have something of an anticlimax. You can relate to that, of course. Last week we had the Archbishop of Canterbury speaking to you. This week, we're looking at Judges. It's this period of a few hundred years after the death of Joshua, but before Israel becomes ruled by kings like Saul, like David, like Solomon. This period in between is the time of the Judges. And Judges, just the name used for the kind of leader that leads Israel in this period before they had kings. And it's this time that we're going to be looking at over the coming weeks. But as we look at the start of our passage, it's clear that the handover from Joshua and his generation onto the next generation, the time of Judges, does not go smoothly. When I was a teenager, I used to enjoy running long distances. I used to run for Medway Athletics Club. And one day, as a teenager, I got selected to be a part of the senior men's team in a cross-country race. I was so proud to have been selected. When we arrived, as usual for our warm-up, we jogged around the course to familiarise ourselves with the route. I never usually paid too much attention to this, because realistically there was always going to be someone ahead of me that I could follow. The race was a relay, where each runner did one lap of the route through fields and woodlands before returning to the start, where they handed over to the next runner in the team. I was running the second leg. I remember standing on the start line with the other second leg runners, waiting to see who would emerge first from the woodlands. Much to my surprise, and if I'm honest, to my horror, I saw the red and white of Medway Athletics Club emerge first, a long way ahead of anyone else. They handed the baton over to me. I set off through the fields and into the woods. In the woods, it was dark. I had no one to follow, and I hadn't paid attention to which way the route went. I took the wrong path, got horribly lost, and I don't remember the position I was in when I finally made it out of the woods. But I do remember the look on my teammates' faces. The race for us was very much over. And I think that this is a picture of what we see at the start of Judges. Moses has led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt before passing the baton on to Joshua. Joshua has led them into the promised land before handing the baton on to the next generation. The next generation takes the wrong path. They do not follow God. They get hopelessly lost, and everything goes wrong. This is how Judges begins. In our chapter in verse 8, Joshua dies at the age of 110. In verse 9, he is buried. In verse 10, we see the next generation emerge. And then verse 11, we're told, "Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them." Moses and Joshua have set them up for life with God in the promised land. But so quickly do they turn to evil and worship of the Canaanite gods. The speed at which it's possible for God's people to go from flourishing to disaster is terrifying and should be a warning to us. It's easy to look around St. John's and see all that God has done, see a church that is growing, see lives that are changing, and assume that this is going to go on forever. Why wouldn't it? This beautifully restored church building that we're enjoying being in today first opened 205 years ago. And when it was built back in 1821, the intention was to build something that would seat as many people as possible. I think initially that was something like 1,500 people that could be seated in this building. Yet by the 1990s, the church doors had closed with no plans ever to reopen them. We have no guarantee that the church in the next generation will flourish in the same way that it has in the previous. And we, a new generation planted back into this church, need to remember how quickly it is possible for a generation to turn from God and to guard against that. So, what's the difference between Joshua's faithful generation and the one that comes after? Well, we see it in verse 7. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Compare that with verse 10. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. They knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. The difference is that the first generation contained those who had seen the great things that God had done. It's not that everyone in that generation had seen these great things, but we're told the people served the Lord through the lifetime of those who had seen them. I can only imagine that those people who had travelled with Joshua and had seen God at work told the stories of what they had seen for the rest of their lives. And the people who hear these stories themselves follow God. But the next generation grew up not knowing the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. So what are we to do if we care about our generation? If the difference between the generations is that one has seen God at work and one hadn't, then surely that is the challenge for us. We need to be seeing God at work. I know from my own experience that the times that I have most clearly seen God at work have been the times when I've put myself in positions where I have needed him to work. It's when you listen to God and step out in faith, putting yourself in a place where the only possible answer is a miracle, and you pray earnestly for that miracle, that you see miracles happen. We need to be seeking God. We need to be praying big prayers so we can be those who have seen the great things that the Lord has done. And if the difference between that one generation and the next is telling the stories of what they had seen, then surely that is what we need to do too. We chat after church over tea and coffee, don't we? And if you're like me, conversations will often be about what we've been doing during the week. Wouldn't it be great if over the coming months we start talking more and more about what we've seen God do each week? Brothers and sisters, it is so important that we are not only vigilant for our generation, but that we are looking out for the next, to whom we shall pass the baton on. You know, that is why all that we do for the children and young people here at this church is so important. You know, we, of course, had a baptism here this morning. You know, the promises that are made in baptism and the decisions we're making about how we intend to bring up the next generation. You know, the promises we make to pray for them and to support them in their faith are so important. This is all important because the message of Judges shows us how we must not take it for granted. Unfortunately for the Israelites, however, the next generation makes the wrong choices. Let's read verse 10. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. So this next generation has rejected God and chosen to worship other gods. But God cannot just ignore his people's sin. He punishes it. Let's continue in verse 12. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baals and Ashereths. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. But it doesn't stop there. God sends someone to save them. Verse 16, then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. In the story of Judges, we see something of the story of the gospel. First, the people sin as they turn their backs on God and worship something else. Second, the consequence of sin as they face punishment and distress. Third, God sending a saviour to rescue them. You might have heard the Bible being described as a bit like a stick of seaside rock. You know the long, sugary sweets that have the name of a seaside town printed all the way through, and wherever you cut it, you see the word Margate, unless you're in Folkestone. The Bible is very much like that. Whenever you open it, you find the same message of redemption running all the way through that points us to Jesus. Judges is in places a pretty dark and disturbing book. If a film had the characters and plot of Judges, I suspect I'd turn it off due to it being too dark, twisted and violent for me to want to watch. That's guaranteed you come back next week, hasn't it? Even the heroes of the story are pretty flawed at times. But in each of these Judges, despite their sometimes extreme flaws, we see clearly that same message of redemption, God sending a rescuer that runs all the way through the Bible and which points us to Jesus. The real tragedy of Judges, though, is that there isn't just one judge. God doesn't just need to save his people once. 7 times in the book of Judges, we see repeated this phrase that we had in our chapter. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Or again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. That phrase is repeated 7 times. So God raises up judges again and again to save his people. And each week we'll be looking at a different judge, because this cycle of sin, suffering, and redemption occurs again and again throughout Judges. Many years ago, Esther and I were going on a journey. We were travelling north, starting late on a Friday evening. So we decided to break our journey for the night in Coventry. This was before the days when everyone had maps on their phones, and I was using a pretty basic sat-nav. It was late. The traffic was heavy. The journey was tiring. But we finally arrived in Coventry. And when we arrived, we were driving round this city centre ring road. Our sat-nav directed us to leave this ring road mere minutes from where we were staying. It was late at night. I was tired and looking forward to getting some rest. But the centre of Coventry was flooded. Roads were closed. And we soon ended up back on the same ring road doing another loop, until the sat-nav once again took us off at the same junction as before. City centre was still flooded, the roads were still closed, and we found ourselves back on the ring road doing yet another loop. This happened again and again and again. We'd arrived late at night, and we spent over 2 hours driving round and round the same loop. You know, I looked up that ring road yesterday. It takes about 3.5 minutes to drive round. Over 2 hours is a lot of loops. Each time hoping that something different would happen. and each time finding ourselves back on the same ring road, going round again and again and again. Somehow we finally managed to get to where we were staying in the early hours of the following morning, and we vowed that we would never go to Coventry again. The story of Judges is one of repeated cycles. Again and again, God's people turn away from him and worship other gods. Again and again, disaster strikes God's people. Again and again, God hears their distress. And again, he raises up a judge to save them. But each time, instead of finding themselves back on track, they just start the same loop all over again. As soon as the judge dies, the people turn back to their sin. They turn away from God and start worshipping the gods of the people around them all over again. And this cycle repeats throughout the book of Judges. Let's read verse 16. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. They quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors, who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people turned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshipping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. This is a repeated cycle. Why do they never learn from the mistakes of the previous generation? Why do they make the same mistakes over and over again? I'm sure each time they would have promised themselves that they would never again turn away from God. Back in verse 4, just before where we started reading today, when confronted with their sin, we're told the people wept aloud. They grieved their sin. But I think that there is something in our human nature that allows us to go from one day deciding that something is a bad idea to the next day doing it all over again. We see it across the generations in Judges. But I think we see it in our own lives too, because it's the nature of sin. There are things that we do that we know that are bad for us, that we vow not to repeat, but we still find ourselves doing. I'd vowed I'd never return to Coventry. The next year we were heading up north again on a Friday evening. I was looking for somewhere mid-journey to stay. I suggested Coventry. Esther told me no way. I said, there's no chance the same thing could happen again. This time it will be fine. It wasn't. Round and round and round. Genuinely never doing that again. Are there things that we vow never to do again, yet find ourselves somehow drawn back to them? If so, there is something we can do about it. As we finish, I want to look at why it is that the Israelites keep returning to the same sin. If you remember, they repeatedly turn away from God, and they worship the gods and goddesses of the Canaanites, the Baals and the Ashtoreths. It seems that they're unable to stop themselves. But in fact, they could have avoided it. Before Israel entered the promised land, it had been populated by Canaanites, people descended from Noah's grandson, Canaan. These people had over time become increasingly evil. The worship of their gods involves temple prostitution and human sacrifice, specifically child sacrifice. And God had decided that this could not be allowed to continue. As Israel entered the promised land, God had ordered them to drive out the Canaanites and to destroy their altars. He didn't want their places of worship to remain in the land where he was going to live with his people. But if you read Judges chapter 1, you will see that the Israelites did not fully drive out the Canaanites, but allowed them to continue living among them. In verse 1 of chapter 2, God says, "I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land, but you shall break down their altars. Yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this?" Israel's repeated failure is that they turn to worship the gods of the Canaanites. But the reason that they're able to be tempted is that they did not obey God's commands to remove the temptation. They had left the altars in place. And I think we can learn from this. Taking direct lessons from Judges can appear difficult. As Christians, we're commanded to be a people of peace and love. But the time of Judges seems characterized by war. Literally driving out Canaanites is far removed from what we are called to do. Rather, we're called to live among and alongside those who don't know God, in the hope that through how we live and what we say, they might see the truth and follow him. So how do we usefully apply the lessons of Judges today? I think that much of what we read in the Old Testament that happens literally, physically, and historically, we can apply spiritually today. So what do the Canaanites mean for us? We're not called to drive anyone out of any land, quite the opposite. We're not called to tear down altars, but we can consider this spiritually and apply it to our hearts, where we are to drive out all that is impure, where we should break down the altars where we personally put things, any other thing, above our God. Why did the Israelites repeatedly turn to the worship of the God of the Canaanites? Because they left the altars to those gods temptingly close at hand. I doubt that any of us are tempted to worship those gods, Baal and Ashtoreth, but we each know what it is that does tempt us, what it is that we've decided we'll never do again, but like the Israelites, we repeat the cycle. Are there things that cause us to be tempted that we need to avoid? Altars that we need to tear down, to ask God to tear down for us? Because the book of Judges, in spite of all that is dark and disturbing, points us towards a ray of hope. God hears the cries of his people and sends a judge to save them. We see that repeated message throughout the Bible, that God will raise up a saviour to save his people. That's the start of Judges. I hope you're looking forward to the rest.